this week's God Squad Upfront. Here's where we discuss big issues and trending topics. If you're ready, so are we.
God Squad Up Front. My name is Maureen Gumringer. Today we are talking about the upsurge or the ongoing problem of police brutality. We probably will discuss some of the history of policing and some of our hopes for making policing less violent toward particularly Black people, Indigenous people, people of color. We have Kay Brown with us this week. We're excited that she's joining us. And Kalila, take it away.
This week has been, for me, completely depressing. Sometimes you think nothing can shock you more than you're already shocked, but looking at the trial and then seeing that the young man so close to where George Floyd was killed, he gets killed by an officer that cannot tell her taser from her 9mm, which seems absurd to me since one is made of plastic and one is made of metal. And then a 13-year-old that does not have a weapon in his hand. And it does nothing to encourage you about the ability of the police department to do its job appropriately. And I'm not saying that all policemen do not do their jobs appropriately, but it is significant when people keep dying needlessly. And that a 13-year-old is dead, a 20-year-old is dead, and there's no reasonable explanation. I don't think you can have a reasonable explanation for a 13-year-old being dead, but it doesn't give citizens any kind of feeling of safety, knowing that these things could possibly happen to their child, to their son, to their brother. And it's sad, it's scary. And when I heard the words of Dante's mother, and when she spoke about justice, and she said there'll never be justice for her because she can't get her son back. She's right. She's going to have to live with that for the rest of her life. It's a tragedy for her, but it's a tragedy for all of us, and it's scary. So I'm curious what the rest of you thought about what happened and what we can do about it.
That one's always it's always really, really hard, right? Like, I'll say as a Black mom who's raising two boys in the South, one 11 and one just turned 7, one of the things that the little one wanted to buy with his birthday money was like this little police officer set. He comes from a military family on his father's side, and he, even though his mom does all of the protests and all of the activism, the thing he sometimes like to do is think about military and being an officer one day. And, oh, look, mom, there's a sheriff, like a lot of young kids do. But in that set was like the little pen, the little gun, the little shields. And he wanted to take some of the toys outside while he rode the bike that he got for his birthday. And I was like, well, you can take the little badge, but the little gun is black with the, little orange thing on the end. You can't take that out. Him being 7, he's like, okay, mommy. And then he tries to sneak it I see it while he's riding his bike. I'm like, absolutely not. We're turning around right now. We're going back home. And that was the moment that I really had to have a conversation with my child about what the consequences would be in a suburban neighborhood for him riding his bike outside, minding his own business with what could possibly be mistaken for an actual weapon, even though he's 7 years old. And that was one of the most heartbreaking moments for me as a mom, seeing as how the first time it was a heartbreaking moment was when I had to do that with my 11-year-old son when he was around that same age. And sometimes people talk about how young do you talk to the kids about it, or when do they have to learn about this and that. And usually when we have those conversations, it's centered around white people, their families, and the kinds of conversations that they feel are permissible for their kids because they want their kids to live in this bubble as long as possible. And it's seeing like literally a 13-year-old boy, you know, it's like, at what age does my kid become a threat? And that's the thing that we're with my mom that had two daughters. She didn't really have to think about that in the same kind of way that I'm thinking about that right now. And in this moment, that feels really heavy because the standard of not having my son be drugged by the media, if something were to happen to him, is pretty much perfection. And even with that, there's always going to be something. So for me, it's like that super sadness that's tied to it, where I know I couldn't even follow everything coming out about the trial because it's just, I couldn't function at work. You know, like it's perpetual reminders that no matter what you do, you're a threat. Your kids are going to be a threat. You're not going to make as much money. Your hair is a thing that can be vilified for. Like, there's always these extra layers of how I've had to learn how to police myself, and then how I'm actually teaching that self-policing to my children in 2021. And that is one of the saddest things about just like watching everything, where sometimes, you know, I see things where people on Facebook are like, if there's another story about Black people in oppression or Black people in slavery, I just can't watch it anymore. Because at a certain point, it becomes too much. When do you get to see yourself without it being tied to shackles and oppression? When do you get to see yourself just like living a genuine, authentic life? You know, you look at stuff like even the Cosby Show, because of prior acts and things that he did, even some of those staples that we had aren't actually staples that you can watch, or you watch the behind the scenes tales of some of these shows that we all cared about, and you hear about how the actors were treated badly and how other people were treated badly. And it's just, at what point does it end? And then at what point is it my responsibility to keep pushing this forward? And then at what point is it possible to start talking to allies about what they need to do to stop this from being pushed forward?
Maybe it ends when every Black and brown mother doesn't have to think about Tamir Rice when her son goes to the park. Maybe it ends when a Black lieutenant driving in a car doesn't get stopped by the police for no reason, and then he gets sprayed in the face again and again and again, just to show who has the power and who doesn't. Maybe that's what it ends. So for someone who gets tired about hearing about Black oppression, let them get out and fight against Black oppression. Let them get out and fight against segregation. Let them go to Washington and make a barrier so that the nationalists don't get inside the Capitol next time they try it, because they will try it again. Let them do that. And then maybe there'll be no reason to talk about oppression, because after 400 years, there's still oppression. So maybe that's when we don't have to get on Twitter and talk about such issues. Maybe when 13-year-olds don't get shot in the back or in the heart, because even though we've gone over these things, we still haven't gone over the fact that Sandra Bland, there's no reason why she's dead, but she's dead. and it seems to be a forgotten subject. She was stopped for a broken headlight, but for some reason, she was dead in her cell, and no one has investigated that fact with any legitimacy. She did not hang herself. We know that just as sure as the sun rises,
Right.
she is dead. Someone killed her. Until someone has paid for her murder, then we don't have to talk about these things. But we have to keep talking about these things. I didn't want to look at the trial every day, but I made myself look at the trial every day because I need to stay connected to the pain of other people, because if I don't, then I'm not going to react to their pain. And we all need to react to their pain. We all need to stand and protest for the mothers who have lost their sons. And for the thought, because we will lose our children, black and white, just like the boy that, I mean, the man who killed the two white protesters in Kenosha. They're forgotten about. He killed two people and he's drinking beer in a bar. And it just came out that a lot of policemen donated to his bond. So much for law and order.
Well, we had a lot of people who during the protests had conversations. Well, Kay, I understand that everybody's angry, but I don't agree with the burning down of things and the destruction of property. And I'm like, the hell was your property? You can rebuild a police station. Y'all were rebuilding them bigger and better anyway. You can rebuild or put back windows if they get broken out. But when Black lives are lost, and when lives are lost, you can't get that back. And in this country, unfortunately, it's property and other things are valued over Black life. And then at the other token, I think about, for our children, what does it feel like from some of them birth to live in a country where you see Black bodies drop on TV and on YouTube over and over and over and over and over? I mean, it's like, what, like, as a parent, where do you, like, how do you navigate the possible PTSD that some of these children have? How do we navigate for some people, the desensitizing that happens because you've seen things happen over and over, that your body is giving certain kinds of responses? Like, the thing that I wrestle with in this moment is like, how do we, not just as adults, think, how do we move the ball forward, but what do we do with our kids? Because I know growing up, we heard about these things and we knew that they happened, but we didn't see the replays on YouTube at the touch of a fingertip, over and over and over and over, just Black bodies laying on the floor, just over and over and over. And I haven't, as a country, since, I'll say, some of our grandparents saw lynchings over and over and over again, and thinking about the level of PTSD that came from that, what do we do for our children in some of those moments? Because this is like just emotionally really difficult, and sometimes numbing, coming out of the summer, where literally people are out in the street all summer, and now I'll say in Greensboro, they have municipal elections coming up and it's business as usual for them. We already have Black contractors like, well, we still are being treated badly. We still have citizens making complaints about we're not getting treated fairly. We still have numbers and data showing that police stops haven't changed. They've just gone up. And it's like, people have already started to turn blind eyes to it, where it's like that cherry picking of movements, right? So we have allies that went from, oh my God, this crisis at the border, God, Black Lives Matter, to, oh my God, Asian Lives Matter, and it's just like, okay, some of these things are tied together. The thing that we need to be fighting is actual systematic oppression, and you probably should spend less time kicking and screaming and dancing in my face and more time with their actual family members, cousins, grandmas, fathers, husbands, sisters, whoever, to start having conversations with them so that people start dismantling the racism and racist that is happening within their own families.
The thing that bothers me too, during the riots, right after George Floyd was killed, it was proven that a lot of the fires, a lot of the broken glass, it was not done by protesters at all. That there were people that came from different cities from the nationalist movement that actually broke the glass and set the fires.
Yes, we had
Until
some here in Greensboro.
Mhm. Until we see proof of actually who initiated these things, it's so easy to point to the protesters and said, see what they've done? And I really objected to President Biden talk about looters and protesters doing things when there was no evidence to prove that they did that. Okay, so until we know exactly who's doing what, let's hold off making the call. And I really think that if things are going to be properly investigated, let's look at the total picture, because in most of these situations, it had nothing to do with the protesters. Protesters have been, for 98% of the time, been peaceful protesters. In fact, they've mastered the art of peaceful protesting and doing it correctly. And so it's instigators that would like to give the police a reason to spray peaceful protesters, to end the protesting, to delegitimize the right of protesters to violate their constitutional rights, and that's wrong. So until there's proof, until there's proper investigation who's actually breaking the law, then I think it's improper to label things, and there should be some type of independent forces actually standing and doing the watching and taking pictures and being able to use their facial recognition to see who's doing what. They have sophisticated
Yeah.
technology, use it.
Mine is, even if they did break the windows, so what? I sat through history class and listened to how when white people felt upset, they Boston Tea Party, fight for independence, like the burning down of fields, like the destruction of property when people get upset has been a revolutionary moment when it was white communities fighting against tyranny of their own folk back home. But then if Black people fought, then it's a slave revolt. These people are dangerous and inherently this or inherently that. So my thing is less about the destruction of the property, because I'm like, so what if it got destroyed? The frustration somebody feels that they can't go to the Walmart when they want to. I'm like, imagine you just can't walk outside your door or even be in your house without harassment from police or other people that want to see you harm. Like, what was the boy that was just out in his own neighborhood and some guy comes up to him and now they're like droves of people outside of their house, like right now, like, you will not treat this child like this, not on our watch here. My thing is, sometimes I will say the thing that was one of the most, I won't say effective, but the thing that people listened to the most last year during the uprising was the fact that their stuff wasn't safe. I don't know if I can get to work. I don't know if they're going to shut down the highway. Like the part of the I don't know, and the understanding that if that was my baby, which I had a white lady tell me, if that was my baby, I'd want everything burnt down and tore down. And if I had to watch it on replay every single month or every other week, this place would have been tore down. And I'm like, we have to understand what some of those responses are. And even if something gets tore up, it gets tore up. But I think that there's still like this emotional piece of it that, like, for our kids though, because most people are inherently nonviolent, but for our kids though, what kind of support can we provide for them in seeing it and then knowing and identifying that that is you? Like seeing yourself reflected in that person.
I mean, I can relate to the emotion, but for every action, there's a reaction. And you have a police force that's going to become unhinged. And I think that for every broken glass, there could be a bullet in the back. So I think that, yeah, okay, protest, sit down in the streets, react to it with your voice, react to it with your signs, but if it's going to mean dead bodies, then I'm against breaking the glass. I'm really against burning it down. I think that we've got to come up with more. We've got to find another way to raise our voice, because because for every action there's reaction. I don't know what the rest of you think,
Well,
but
that's the point, is that Black bodies have been dropping in the streets for quite
That's the
some
reaction.
time, and swinging from the trees, and it's been peaceful protest after peaceful protest, and it's been the police that have shown up to beat up peaceful protesters. That's why we had to master the art of just standing in the street getting beaten. And I think as generations change, I know as I learned some things, one of the things I mentioned was, why in God's name would I stand in the middle of the street knowing that they're going to beat me? And this is the best form of protest if I'm actually protesting the fact that they don't respect Black bodies, which is why now I'll say in my movement work, I've leaned a little bit more on, we need more allies out in the streets to show people that it's not just our bodies on the line,
right.
to show that we have allyship, to show that this level of behavior is just not okay anymore. Because regardless whether or not we show up peaceful, or whether or not we show up in groups, like at the mall here in Greensboro, if you show up with a group of 5 or more, especially if you're Black, that is like a gang of people, and they will assertively break you up. And that's just walking in the mall at this point.
But that's the purpose of allies. If you have a diverse group of allies, there's less likely to be shot by a group of policemen. If you have white, Black, mixed, Asian, Hispanic, if you have a large group of allies, then it's the way it is. You are less likely, or the police are less likely to start shooting if you have a group of white allies with you.
Well, police do know how to handle situations without killing people, because if Carolina beats Duke in a football game or high stakes basketball game, they go down and tear up Franklin Street, they magically know how not to kill someone, even when people are outside just literally tearing stuff up.
That's exactly right.
They're mostly white. So it's one of those things where when the strategy is literally for the other side, when the strategy is literally they're Black, they must be something, I can walk outside. There is, like, to a certain level, there is no strategy that's going to change my skin tone, my kids' skin tone, like my family's stuff, like like when you walk outside, you're carrying the target with you. How do you out strategize the target being literally you?
Okay, so how do we get white people in the game?
A lot of that, though, I think before you even ask the question of how do we get more alliances and how do we get more people here, is looking at, especially in the South, the history of policing is directly related to the history of slavery. And police weren't there to really be, doing what they're doing today in terms of traffic violations and all that, in theory, right? They were there to be catching slaves who were running away and reclaiming property that was in the form of Black bodies. And they were also, like Kay mentioned, breaking up groups in the mall, right? One of the other things that police were doing across the nation was ensuring that people weren't able to gather and unionize and rise up against political forces. The police are doing exactly what they were created to do. It's just that people have not realized that because that hasn't been the way it's been sold to others. I think with President Hoover, I'm not the best with presidential timelines, but I think it was with Hoover, there were underperforming rates of police outcomes, and they literally redistricted police precincts to no longer match the political precincts so that they would not be tied to political candidates' outcomes. They know what they're doing. It's not a secret to anybody within this organization and the structure that this is being done intentionally. I think part of it becomes, how do we educate enough people on this is the actual reason for our police force? It's not for the safety of anybody. It's not to make sure there's this sort of concept of law and order and everyone's okay. It's not just, just follow the rules and they won't bother you. This is what this institution was created for. And of course, it's going to continue to uphold that.
To uphold the power structure and the status quo. Yeah.
Why do you think it's so distinct in America? Like if you go to Scotland, for example, the police don't carry those kinds of guns, and most of them don't carry guns at all. They just don't deal in the same way that the American police force the way that they carry on. Why is it here? What
Did
is
the NRA show up around the same time period that the KKK was outlawed or was dismantled officially? I feel like there was a segue there between, I mean,
Yeah, I think there was some strategic some strategic info
branding.
where if they could not do what they were doing and ride through to protect communities from those Negroes, that it was a little bit more strategic for them to actually join the police departments. And then at that point, they could create, shape culture and do what they felt like they needed to do and continuously, push the propaganda for it. But that it would be harder to control and harder to identify who's who once you get in there, because they typically, what I've seen is rely on that. Well, not all officers are bad. I'm like, but if you have a lot of officers and they know that those 3 officers are bad and are racist and they still work with them and show up and don't do anything, then you actually have a full force of bad officers. And then in looking at, once you push for more diversity in police departments, now we're having some things start to come to head even within the police department. And thinking about the Black woman in New York that was pushed out of the police department right before she was about to get her pension because she literally pulled a fellow officer off of the neck of like a child or something. And she literally had to fight, like there were economic costs to her doing that. Like there were a lot of costs to doing that. And when you actually look at it, it was like, dang, it took actually hiring more Black women or people who, share more of our greater community values to actually go in and take a stand and say enough is enough. And then likely a lot of the what happened over last year that pushed the culture of policing so much so quick on what people were not going to deal with anymore, that then allowed her to win that court case. So now she can get her pension and back pay for it. But I think about some of the conversations that I've had with folks who know Black officers here in North Carolina that did some of those same things and dealt with some of those same consequences that, like,
But look how long it took her.
yeah,
Look how long it took her.
because I think that was what, 2003 that it happened.
Can you imagine how hard it was for her to become a cop at that time in
Yeah,
history?
and then make it to a pension. So I'm like, how
Yes.
many years on a force do you have to have? Even with that, like, I don't know if I mentioned on the last one, when my grandmother used to work in a factory, some white men approached her at work, mind you, going, well, does a brown cow give brown milk? And I'm like, that's just in a daggone factory, let alone you're working with a system that is oppressing and beating up your people. The emotional toll that takes on you must be like immeasurable. So I actually sat down with some Black officers and said, what is your experience right now during this time? And I've had officers tell me all kinds of things, like when they go home, like with their extended families, you have extended family members that they're like, fuck police. We don't do police, and you are still out for doing it. But then in the same flip side, the same person who walks into certain spaces see things that are harmful to Black folks getting done, and they're the ones who disproportionately are tasked with intervening on it, even when that means that they know it's going to come at a cost to their career, or they could get pushed out. And then where else are they going to get picked up? Especially if, you're a Black officer that gets pushed out and you're in a larger city, where else do you go? Because typically it gets worse from there when you look at in the South and go into rural areas.
Well, look at the case in Minnesota. The Somalian policeman, first time the situation occurred, and he was charged with, I forget, manslaughter. First time, and it was, if you looked at the case objectively, it was accidental, and he got manslaughter. Never had anything bad in his record before. George Floyd, I mean, not George, Chauvin, who murdered George Floyd, 18 incidents. And he was never called on the carpet for anything. Not until someone had the good sense to tape him, to record him, something he could not escape. Now, the other infractions involved a pregnant woman, him putting his foot on the neck of a 14-year-old. What did it take? It finally took for him to kill someone. So how was it that and then the police, what's it called? The police fraternity or whatever, they have raised over $1 million for his defense. Isn't he a lucky guy?
So individuals, police are human, right? But individuals might be attracted to the heroism. I mean, this is why we see little boys who want to be police officers, right? Is that there's a certain heroism that is associated with it. And the institution as a whole is not heroic. It was never meant to be heroic. It was never meant, it was always meant to hold up power structures, and separate, people with money and means and power to keep them safe from folks without money and means and power. And so that the Fraternal Order of Police raising millions of dollars for Chauvin is gut-wrenching. I don't understand how this continues. I also don't understand how an officer can have 17 infractions or 17 incidents and still be eligible for hire. This is an intrinsic problem within policing, right? Like there are truth and reconciliation movements in every profession. Social work has had to reckon with its racism and its injury to children and families. There are many, many incidents throughout the last 100 years, which is approximately how long social work has been a profession. It is not unreasonable to ask that there be truth and reconciliation with policing, but they'd have to reconfigure the whole thing. And that brings us back to defunding, right? Or at least reallocating and demanding community policing rather than militarization.
Because, well, I think policing is social work. It's social work
It can
that
be.
potential, and
Yeah.
that you can't, people go to school sometimes for years to become a certain thing. Yeah, if you some police officers, they go to school for 4 years, they get a degree in criminal justice. Other officers, they go to the academy for what, 6 months, and they're eligible to become a police officer. Well, I think 6 months just doesn't crack it. And I do think that you should have to undergo some type of psychological testing to see if you are the kind of person that becomes overly anxious, if you have a temper, if you have certain type, if there's something noticeable in your personality or your character that's going to make you go off on someone. And also, if there's something, there should be background checks on police officers too.
It's not emotional dysregulation, though. That's a myth that was associated with intimate partner violence as well, that it was a mental health disorder and it was about emotional dysregulation, anger dysregulation. But what we found is that if you treat folks, male perpetrators of intimate partner violence, if you include gender deconstruction as part of their treatment, they are able to reformulate their habits, because it's never about anger dysregulation. It's about gender roles and assumptions about gender and assumptions about power and control and entitlement and what is deserved. And so psychological evaluations for police that's helpful. I want to know that, folks in that role are not sociopaths. That's a good thing to know.
Mm-hmm.
But the entirety of policing would have to undergo racial and deconstruction of racism, which is tricky because it's literally the thing that holds it together. It's where it came from. It's where it came from.
How do you figure? Like, break it down to me. What are you trying to say? I mean,
About the institution of policing?
yeah, like, okay, you know me. Do I look like a person that can go off? I mean, what's your perception?
So I think what you're asking is do police become police because they want to be in control of other people? Or are they, do some police, or is that something that evolves once they have the power and the power of the state behind them, and a state or a county issued or city issued weapon? Is that the question? Whether they,
Like, what came first, the chicken or the egg? I mean, you know
Well,
what I mean?
I think the bad policies and the foundation was built and rooted in racism. Even if you add a good person into that system, and what they are required to do by law is inflict racist policies onto other people, it's one of those things that during times of war, you have people who typically may have been good people, done good things, but you're tossing them in a situation that isn't necessarily the best isn't necessarily the best situation. When you look at things around policing, some of the struggles that I've seen some officers have is when they may have gotten into it based on the narrative that they were
Yeah, but
protect and serve, and then based on procedure they are required to do things that sometimes they don't always agree with, which is why I think we need a multi-pronged approach to one. People hear defund and are like, you just take all of them out and there's anarchy. It's like, no, but we are requiring that officers do some functions that should not be functions of officers. So when we talk about responding to mental health calls, some things around being in schools with children and teaching them about being good people, that is not the role of a police officer. Things like going and handing out food and gift bags to kids, like that's actually not your role. There are other people in the community that should be funded to fully and properly do those things. If we funded those correctly, then we wouldn't need as much money in the police budget, nor will we need all of the officers. Now, will there be some people that maybe somebody got to call the cops on them because they're out there? That is probably still going to be a thing. However, it is communities and lawmakers that have created the condition that has allowed certain types of crime to flourish. As in, if people can make good wages and get their basic needs met, the instances of petty theft and shoplifting from the damn Walmart would be next to nothing. But the fact that we have not done what it is that we're supposed to do as a society and allocated our money accordingly, and we've sent it to big developers and police and sheriff's departments, and now we have all these nice jail facilities and all of these redone courthouses and everything. It's like that money should not have gone to those entities. That money should have actually gone to schools, tutors, after school care, healthcare workers, and a lot of other things. But it's one of those things where the system, the foundation was built on trash. And since then, we've added some additions that maybe we need to start pulling back. And as we pull that back, we need to be building a better house that was built on a better foundation.
yeah, but it also that money that was spent was not paid to him to put his foot on somebody's neck for 9 minutes. And I know myself, I know there is nothing in this world that would make me put my foot on a man's neck for 9 minutes and let him die. I would never do that to another human being. I don't care how angry I got. I would not suffocate him to death. I wouldn't. So,
but
I
in
mean,
the
if I
aftermath,
was really that pissed off, I might do something to get even, but not to the point of doing something that horrendous, especially to an innocent person that did not violate me. You see, this was a situation where Floyd did not violate Chauvin. He did not violate. He had no reason to
No.
do something like that. So that means Chauvin was a nut to begin with.
Chauvin is ill. Let's be really clear about this. He's not well. He's being prosecuted for murder, and there's a good chance that that the charges will stick and he'll be convicted, which is a rare case, right? Like that doesn't happen enough. And so the tricky part about Chauvin as an example is in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder, I saw white men say, well, I'm not the kind of man who would put my foot on somebody's neck. Okay, that's cool. I'm glad that I don't work with sociopaths. That's fantastic. But also that's not really the full scope of the problem, right? That we have a systemic problem. Chauvin is the poster boy right now of police brutality. But we have, I guess to your point, Kalila, it's important to know that there aren't sociopathic police. That's important.
But also,
I don't know that they're all
they shouldn't walk
sociopaths.
away.
That's a
Also,
low
that
standard.
police force, and the politicians and all these people shouldn't. If he's convicted, they shouldn't walk away thinking, "Oh, we did a good thing. He was convicted. Everything's all right. Justice works in America." Because
That's exactly right.
That's going to be wrong.
Right.
So we also have to look at whiteness and power. And that's wonderful that there's white men who are not in a position of power that say, I would never do that. We also kind of know that that's not true, right? If you look at the Stanford prison experiment, where they took a bunch of folks, most of whom were white, and said, some of you are prisoners and some of you are the guards. And we want you to just pretend that this is, the way it's going to be. And we're going to watch how you all navigate this. They had to stop the study because it turned so violent. What we know, and one of the takeaways from that is not that this is human behavior, not that this is what will happen when you put any people in a group like this. It's what happens when you put white men in a group like this. And it's really, really important to acknowledge that, because when they're not handed that power and said, here, you are now in charge of managing these other people, they may not be violent. That may be very, very true. But when you put them in a space that systemically and structurally says you are in charge of these people, we do know that violence comes out of that. So that self-proclaimed statement of I as a white man wouldn't do that does not hold any water. There's no merit to that. And we have to start acknowledging that a lot of what we're seeing and a lot of what you're not, clearly you're constantly saying, I don't understand this. I don't know why this is. I can't relate to this. Of course you can't relate to this. You are not a white man in power. When you are a white man in power, it becomes the norm, especially when there's narratives such as, well, if you don't resist and you do exactly what I say, you'll be fine. That's the going narrative with police force is, hey, just don't do anything, comply, and it'll be fine. So any kind of movement then becomes interpreted as non-compliance and justified. But all of that is how power ends up being maintained and abused by whiteness and maleness. So we're talking about white males predominantly.
But my father never did anything like that. He was never violent. He was never aggressive. He was a good man. He was a kind man to everyone.
My dad was a white guy too, but he was terrified of police because they brutalized him as a young man, growing up in New York City. He always disliked police. My mother worked for the police department for years. He had really strong feelings because he was of the same sort of opinion that Katie is, or the position that Katie is representing right now. So are all white men violent? Absolutely not. But there is a condition, a societal condition that tends to allow violence of this type. I didn't find this out till recently. I didn't realize it. But the prevailing wisdom for women up until the 80s and perhaps the 90s, if you were the victim of a sexual assault, the police advised that you stay still, that you don't fight, because you'd be less likely to get hurt. And so they were telling women, that if you were assaulted, that they should be still, which is bananas to me. But it's the same thing. Like if this person is attacking you, whatever you have coming, basically, like you deserve what you get if you put up a fight. And so when Katie just mentioned, the requirement, the cultural requirement, or the narrative, the myth that if you are compliant and quiet and respectful, that nothing will go wrong. Like, this is a narrative that's been around for a very long time, and it's vile. It's absolutely vile.
Yeah, and I think it allows some people to feel entitled to harm other people, and that
That's
it is
right.
their duty to be complicit in it, or it's their duty to not fight back.
That's
So
right.
yes, those people beat on you and hurt you and did this and did that, but you have to just let them do it so that they can understand that you're human too. I'd say I probably subscribe a little more to the Malcolm X portion of that, where, honey, if you want to take it there, we can all take it there. But that is a thing that I think we've done to women, we've done to Black folk, we've done to immigrants, we've done to a lot of different people from a lot of different intersections. And who we don't teach that to is typically white men.
Well, there's a way. I mean, as far as rapists are concerned, and people that commit such acts of aggression, you can still show them mercy, castrate them, and take off one hand, and they're less likely to commit those kinds of abuses because they won't have that sort of access. Can't do much without, may sound violent, but so is rape. Can't rape if you ain't got the tools to do it.
I guess I'm saying, if a person came into my home with the intent to rape me, and there have been officers that have taught me that I'm supposed to lay there, I don't give a damn what that officer taught. I'm going to pull my 22 out, and I could do something about it, would be met with violence. And it's one of those things where you cannot always blame the victim that has been harmed for the reaction that they have, and focus on the reaction of the victim rather than who's actually perpetually perpetrating some of the crimes.
You gotta use what's ever at hand. If you have a pencil, you're just gonna pick up that pencil and stick it in his jugular vein. I mean, by any means necessary, he's in your home, he's an aggressor. So you do what you have to do. I mean, that's just protecting yourself. He set the standard when he came in your house and he came into your bedroom and he started to attack you. That's an aggressor, and I don't think we were created to just stand by and be subject to that. Allow
But then
ourselves.
for Breonna Taylor and her partner, that was, but they had a gun, and it's like these people, these crazy people that you have no idea who they are, just literally broke into your home at night to do you harm. And I'm like, even if he did have a weapon, you literally just broke into someone's home with a weapon. Like, you're dragging people out of cars, you're pepper spraying them, you're beating them at protests. And then not only that, they go into work on their 9 to 5 and then they're getting emotionally beat down there too. It's just, at a certain point, when do we look past how the victim is being treated, and teaching victims how to take violence, versus actually spending more time with perpetrators to say, this is what you don't do. There are actually actions and consequences for that thing that you did, which is the same thing that where I mentioned from my son. I was like, yeah, you absolutely will not be walking outside with that. There are serious real world consequences to that. Wouldn't it be nice if people were teaching officers that there are real life consequences to taking a life too? And that could mean that your family's life will never be the same. That could mean that your kids you'll never be able to see your kids grow up, because you're going to be taken out of the mix. That your family goes into poverty because now they don't have your income no more, and you're not going to get picked up anywhere else. Like, there should be serious consequences tied in for perpetrators, the same way that we have been tying that level of responsibility to everybody else in this country. Because after a while, it just gets hard.
They have the power of the state. Why are they not emotionally like, why are they not taught emotional regulation strategies and given very, very, very good trauma treatment to avoid this? Like, I never understood, why is it that police are not expected to be emotionally regulated? Why is it that, we go, well, they feared for their lives, so they had to, they had to pull their guns, and castle doctrine extends to everybody apparently except Breonna Taylor's home. It's racist.
Yeah.
So we've had a lively, informative discussion. Katie, do you have any thoughts and feelings on takeaways for?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts and feelings. I think that my takeaway was just that we have to work on educating others as to where some of the roots of this started, and what the actual intention on these structures and organizations are. I also don't think we can necessarily blame violent behavior on mental health concerns, because that is a bit of a double-edged sword. Because what we know about people who have any form of mental illness is that they're really at risk and they are more vulnerable. And so conflating the two and saying, well, these police must be so violent because they have a mental illness, then creates stigma for another population that is already stigmatized. So we have to be real careful about the language we're using when we're having these discussions too. But I think, like a lot of the topics we talk about, I wish there was an easy thing where we could say, hey, we came up with a solution in an hour. But, if that were possible, we'd have a very different lived experience in the world right now.
I have one takeaway for any of you that's watching the program. If you know of a demonstration in America, doesn't matter what city you live in, which state, on the website, please post the day and the time so that people in your area will know where to go, where to stand, a meeting, any type of community response, so that they can join in. I think that's important. And Kay, got a takeaway?
I would say the takeaway for me is there are a lot of layers to this. Like, there were a lot of things that have been laid out over the centuries and decades in this country, and it's going to take a lot to literally dismantle, redo, revitalize, restructure, rethink some of the solutions to these issues, because they're really complicated and it's really layered, and it's literally the roots and fabric of our country and what it's been. And we're going to have to wrestle with it. And how we wrestle with it and who we wrestle with it with is absolutely going to matter. And it's going to take just about all of us to think through that and work through that.